Now, Professor Lawrence Hamilton, research professor in political theory at Wits University, joins us for this discussion. Professor Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us this evening on News at Prime. You just heard the ANC president, the president of our country, Cyril Ramaphosa, in Soweto, there with the ANC Youth League president, saying they're feeling pretty confident about the upcoming elections. What do you make of the governing party's campaign and their likelihood of retaining power?
Good evening, Masa, and good evening to your viewers. Yeah, the ANC electoral machine has definitely stepped things up in the last while. I think it's probably very good for them to have done so. And it's interesting that one of the first places they went to was KZN, or at least that was what we heard about most on the news. I think that their prospects are maybe a little bit better than has been suggested by a lot of media houses, but I think that they will struggle to reach the 50% mark, and that's because while they've done a lot of great things over 30 years, especially around housing, poverty reduction, access to electricity, access to piped water. Of course, there've been a lot of failures, and a lot of failures around really important bread and butter issues that people feel every day: unemployment, inequality, gender-based violence that the president was speaking about there, violent crime, corruption, very bad infrastructure failures, SOEs such as Eskom, Prasa, Transnet not producing. The simple fact of not being able to keep lights on so often and for so long. I think there was something like 335 days in 2023 when there was load shedding. Those simple things, I think, are going to dent the chances of the ANC getting near that 50% mark quite significantly.
There also seems to be, of course, the governing party is all over the country campaigning like other political parties are doing right now as well. But also we're seeing a lot of signing of bills in the last short while that you mentioned too. Just today, signing of that femicide GBV bill as well, the amendment of the NPA bill as well, the signing of NHI as well. During the State of the Nation address, the president had said, when he was referring to the NHI, somebody hand me a pen. Where's my pen? That's all I need and I can sign it. But what we do know is that it's actually not ready for proper implementation yet and to be set up. What do you make of all these bills that are being signed right now?
I'm speaking to you from the UK, and I have to say, all I can say is that compared to the Conservative Party here, his timing is a hell of a lot better than the Conservative Party leader here, in the sense that at least he's able to get these things signed prior to the election. But it does look like a great deal of electioneering in the sense of, particularly around the NHI bill, where you've had a lot of talk and a lot of analysis and a lot of work going into the bill, but there's clear evidence that it's not ready, as you say, for implementation. So that kind of signing of bills, rushing them through, as it were, getting his signature finally on the page, is clearly an attempt by the ANC to start to move faster and to start to show the populace as a whole that they have their interests at heart. I have to say, though, that yeah, it's an interesting one in the sense that so much analysis has been concerned about the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa hasn't showed the kind of strong, firm leadership that many expected from him. And at the 11th hour, he seems to be rushing these things through. So it's a rather strange one for me personally. I've always seen him as this consensus-building politician. And I suppose at the 11th hour, it's dawned on him with absolute clarity that he's got to stop building consensus, in a sense, stop listening and discussing, as he even was talking about there in your clip, and putting pen to paper,
Yeah.
generating policies.
Prof, you know, as he was saying in that clip that he has gone into communities, he's gone to, and he's been listening very carefully. And that's why he's also signed this new GBV bill as well. But I remember also when there were protests and marches across the country after the rape and killing and the murder of Uyinene, and women across the country were saying enough is enough, and they marched to a parliament in Cape Town. The president himself came out, and I remember covering this actually, came out, received the memorandum and said, very similar sentiment to what he was saying in Soweto today as well, to say we are going to take this seriously. This is a crisis. Now he's calling it a pandemic. You know, that was the ANC Youth League leader, Colin Malachi, saying it's the second biggest pandemic in the country, referring to GBV and, of course, unemployment as well. But, Prof, I guess my question to you is that we've heard some of these sentiments already. Will it work?
So, I mean, undoubtedly, GBV is gender-based violence is something that the country has to tackle with real, serious policies and with real serious leadership. And it's a good thing, obviously, that the person himself, Cyril Ramaphosa, is taking these things seriously. But you're right. I mean, it's quite concerning. I don't know how many years ago you're talking about, but it's quite a few years ago. And we get to a point right just before elections where suddenly he signs a bill into legislation. And you've got to ask yourself what's been holding him up. I suppose you could say that it's a lack of decision-making clarity on the part of the president himself. But to be fair to him, it's not just that. He's dealing with a very large, cumbersome party which has been, at loggerheads in very many areas, and is significantly full of factions. So he may have had a lot of his attention on those sorts of things, and not on the kinds of things that, we as citizens need him to be doing. But that's a sign of a really serious problem. That's a sign of a party full of factionalism, at each other's throats, and so not being able to act as representatives of the people and acting in the people's interests. So I would say, it may be enough for some people, but I would say that it isn't enough, and it seems to be way too much at the last minute for my liking, anyway.
You mentioned that you're sitting in the UK now, but your academic institution, Wits, also hosted the president a few weeks ago while he was campaigning, and the focus was on life is better now than it was 30 years ago. And I think that's a bit of a no-brainer, because 30 years ago, we're coming out of a crime against humanity. Do you think that it's telling that these examples aren't of 10 years ago, to say it's better 15 years ago, 18 years ago, the rand is better, employment is better, or crime is better, based off the past 10, 15, 18 years, as opposed to using a benchmark of an apartheid government?
Yeah, I mean, actually, a paper I wrote recently that's published by the HSRC, exactly on these quality of life questions, points to exactly that. There's a kind of watershed in our post-apartheid history, if you can call it a post-apartheid history, and it's around 2010. And if you look at the figures, they confirm that as well. There is a great deal of success that can be shown between 1994 or 96 in terms of housing, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of all of the things I've spoken about, and also in terms of growth, macroeconomic growth, leadership, corruption is not such a central issue. But if you look at those figures from 2010 or 2012, say, up until 2024, there is in most instances, with the exception of poverty reduction and housing, there is in most instances a serious drop So when it comes to unemployment, there's an increase in unemployment. When it comes to inequality, there's an increase in inequality. When it comes to gender-based violence, there's an increase in gender-based violence. Violent crime. There is an average of 0.8% growth since 2012. Now, a lot of this, of course, can be put down to the fact that the Zuma period was a period, as we know, of really serious corruption and what we call state capture. But there have been quite a few years since the end of the Zuma period. And so marking your progress all the way back to 1994, it's obviously true, and there has been actually more than significant progress away from a crime against humanity and apartheid structure. There has actually been very significant, I mean, just to take one figure, access to electricity has gone up between 96 to 2021 from 57% to 89%. So, I mean, there have been some really fantastic achievements on the ground that a lot of very poor people in particular will have felt, and social grants. At one level, the extent to which social grants have been rolled out. I saw a figure recently that I hadn't been able to check at the time, but supposedly 47% of South Africans get most of their household income from social grants. That figure is an indication of the degrees of unemployment, the degrees of inequality, but it's also an indication of some of the successes with which the ANC have managed to put in place a form of a welfare state.
Yeah, and I want us to continue with this conversation. We just need to take a short break, but we will continue with this conversation with Professor Lawrence Hamilton. Welcome back. We are still joined by Professor Lawrence Hamilton, who's a research professor in political theory at Wits University. Now, Prof, we were talking about some of the successes of the governing party as well, such as access to electricity, and those who are able to have a social grant as well. But obviously they would also prefer jobs, which is a big campaign focus for opposition parties as well, that the governing party hasn't been able to crack.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just making that point in terms of the success, the relative success of rolling out a beginnings of a welfare state. But of course, I mean, it is in response to a dire situation of very extreme unemployment. I don't need to rattle out the unemployment figures again. We've heard them so many times. But, you know, we're reaching 60% youth unemployment, which is an unsustainable figure. And so, of course, anybody anywhere would prefer a good paying job to being on forms of welfare. That goes without saying. And absolutely the biggest, besides massive corruption and massive infrastructure failures, the biggest and associated other failure is the lack of growth stimulation that the government has been able to put in place, and the lack of transformation in the economy that would have led to much greater levels of employment and would have led to a reduction in, you know, being the world champion in inequality. Those two things, on levels of unemployment and what they do to people's lives, and the extreme inequality that we live with, lead to the violence that bedevils South African life. Violence in general, and also gender-based violence that we began the conversation with.
Yeah.
I think the two are very, very closely linked. And so that is a massive failing.
And speaking of violence as well, crime being a major problem, the irony of course, the governing party today marching for peace in Soweto on Vilakazi Street, a historic area as well, 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates from that street as well, as we know. But then they are in power. The ANC is the governing party, and then yet they are in the streets marching for peace. Is there a bit of irony to that?
Yeah, there's irony, and there's also this strange inability of a governing party to be able to get itself out of also being a party of liberation. So it's to do with this historical position, and we've seen it in many cases of liberation parties sort of never properly being able to escape from the position of being a liberation party, of thinking of themselves as instantiating the people in some sense, saving the people from colonial or apartheid oppression or whatever it is. And so it is deeply ironic because they're the people in power and they ought to be to be doing the job of securing people's lives. That is the basic job of the state, is to provide security for people. And it is, alongside what I spoke about earlier, is one of the greatest failings of the South African state. Without the provision of security, there is very little that you can do as a citizen. There's very little. Your life is blighted to such an extent that, and this actually goes right across different classes and races and every other distinction and cleavage you may have in a society. Violence touches all of it, and South Africa is a very, very violent society. And until you generate security, and the only real agency that can do that is government, then you're not generating the basic requirement for what in my field is called a civil society, a society that can function properly.
It does also seem, as you're saying, that, while they also may be still trapped in the liberation movement technique kind of doing things, so are some of our voters as well, because they really do pull at the voters' heartstrings. Tomorrow they will have their rally, the Siyanqoba rally, at the FNB Stadium, and obviously it will be packed, as we see from visuals from wherever they go to campaign as well. They still pull at the heartstrings of many, many ordinary South Africans. Even though we have the challenges of crime, corruption, unemployment, the economy failing as well, do you think that we'll be able to get to a point where we vote beyond the history and on the current? And if so, are the current opposition propositions even viable for our voters?
So, I mean, the easy question, the quick and easy answer to your first question is yes. When that will take place is more difficult, of course. A lot of people's hope was that this would be the election where it would take place. But you've just pointed out something really important. I mean, a lot of people, especially in an older generation and maybe especially in certain rural areas, will still see them as the Party of Liberation, and of course they are the Party of Liberation. So that does hold people's attention for a great deal. I think we're very close to that point. I'm not sure if this election is going to be such a watershed as many people have suggested, but I think we're very close to that point, and I think it's a generational thing. So I think that the younger generation, many of whom I teach a lot of the time, show me all the time that they will not vote ANC. The great problem, I think, is what you pointed out in the second part of your question, and that is the alternatives. We have, as the two main parties of opposition, the DA and the EFF, two parties that are so polarized in opposite directions and that are so different in so many different ways. The DA with its very strong ideology of market-led resolution to problems, and the EFF with its very militant and supposedly left-wing approach, do not really provide a very serious alternative choice to the ANC. The ANC is a centrist, broad church party. What the country desperately needs is a credible left-wing alternative to the ANC, and we do not have that. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons why quite a lot of people will still be, as you put it, be pulled at their heartstrings by the Liberation Party and not vote in terms of their economic interests or their class interests or other sorts of interests, partly because there isn't a real alternative in that way.
Even
And
with
so
the
what
new
the-
kids on the block, even with the emergence of your BOSAs, your Rise Mzansi's, Action Essays, independent candidates as well being introduced, you don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I think something like Rising Zanzi has great potential, but I think it's in its infancy, and we will see how well it does. I don't think so. In my view, a lot of these smaller parties are basically ethno-nationalist parties. They appeal to a small, mostly ethnic type constituency. Freedom Front Plus, IFP, MK now, they all appeal to a small subsection of the populace, not in terms of broad-based class and other forms of association and provision and alternative, but in terms of a form of ethno-nationalist identification. And those may pull people in certain sorts of ways, and they may attract a certain proportion of support, but not in large numbers, I don't believe.
Professor Lawrence Hamilton, really appreciate your time and your insights this Friday night. Thank you very much for joining us on News at Prime.